Ben from Meta Labs to share more about rollup problems. And just a little bit about Meta Labs. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the the team behind the ZK Sync. So they built the ZK Sync, one of the biggest ZK VM L2 that we have in the space, and yeah, and Ben do a lot of research and development there. So yeah, Ben, you can take it over.
The rollup space, and as we're thinking about where we go forward in the next year or so. So next slide, please. Just a few words about myself. So in addition to being the VP of Research at Meta Labs and running the research team there, I'm also a professor at Imperial College London. Just a little bit about my research background. I come from a background in programming languages as well as system security. So some of the stuff that was covered by the previous speaker, Mackenzie from Aztec Labs, is actually near and dear to my heart. But the last 4 or 5 years, I've been focusing squarely on blockchain-related topics, so things related to DeFi, fee mechanisms, audit. So we have a few papers coming out in the next, several months alone on these kinds of topics. So the slides disappeared. Seems like the curse continues. Okay, there it is. The slides are back. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. And so just the TLDR for this presentation. So I think we're still quite early in the design journey when it comes to rollups. I think there are still more design questions than there are answers. And I'll talk about some of the answers that a variety of people in this space are proposing. And I'll kind of pose probably more questions than I'll give you answers for the next 20 minutes or so. So my sense is that we as a community have not arrived at too many points of consensus when it comes to even the simpler aspects of rollup design. Next slide, please. So I think it's no secret there's a significant consolidation of strength behind Ethereum as a layer 1 platform, and that's due to a variety of reasons. One of them is the fact that Ethereum has quite an open design and development process. I think there is just a lot of ingenuity that goes into a whole variety, and I'll mention some of these examples around, I don't know, account abstraction, 5059, some of the things that are coming out with 4844, a variety of EIPs that really have a lot of mind share and a lot of people sort of putting their thoughts as well as the implementation efforts into them. And part of the thing, of course, is that, given the extended bear market, oftentimes this is what happens in bear markets as well. So as part of that, EVM compatibility has become virtually the norm around, I'd say, the majority of the blockchain space, despite any number of shortcomings when it comes to the EVM. I mean, so Solidity as a language, as well as the EVM as a virtual machine, are far from perfect. And in fact, many people have complained about these kinds of things vocally, and there are definite sort of ways to improve upon the EVM, but at the same time, there's a generation of developers who've been trained on Solidity, and as such, you basically have a supply of people who want to build a new platform if you are EVM compatible. And so this is where we are with ZK Sync, and part of it is because that's where developers are as well. So when it comes to scaling up execution, when it comes to making it more affordable as well, Ethereum's plans are actually quite explicit. Their plan is to basically rely on the rollups as a scale-up facility, as a way to basically outsource execution to be largely off-chain with some elements of it that are on-chain still, and that's the rollup story in a nutshell. And that's why we're here. That's why we're focusing on this. Next slide, please. So now this is probably going to be, I'm sure pretty much everybody in this audience has seen this somewhere. So people distinguish between optimistic, broad proof-based rollups and zero-knowledge rollups. We are ZK Sync on the validity proof side, on the zero-knowledge side of this divide, so to speak. And there are probably more companies essentially trying to bring solutions to that side of this space as well. And on top of these sort of end-to-end platforms, if you will, there's any number of companies trying to add solutions and kind of playing up to the modularity thesis. So, for example, there are DA solutions, data availability solutions like Celestia and EigenLayer DA, and so I'll mention those in passing, in subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So here's a few interesting data points, and this is something I got from L2Bit, a site that basically keeps track of rollups progress, the past several days. This is activity or growth, I should say, in the last year or so. And a few things to point out. So the activity as measured by the number of settled transactions, that's what you see in the top chart. And there's a scaling factor, which is like how much are rollups settling more than the mainnet in aggregate, right? All the rollups that they consider, like, what's the scaling factor like? And it seems like, there's a chance that that number will keep growing. That is to say, the amount of activity that's settled on the collection of rollups we have will keep growing compared to where a mainnet is. So some transactions will probably still be settled on mainnet, but a variety of things will actually go to rollups. Here's another sort of set of data points at the bottom here, which is to say the total value locked, which is not a perfect measure, by the way, but it's an interesting one anyway to consider, keeps going up, right? So you can probably identify individual points, like if you go back to March, given that a number of ZK EVMs, including ours, became publicly available, you sort of see significant growth as a result of that. Next slide, please. So I wanted to touch at least briefly on a variety of aspects of rollup design, and this is what I have listed here on the slide. So I'll basically take these issues, these aspects in order, and try to spend a bit of time on each of them in the next 10, 15 minutes, I would say. So first, decentralization. Next slide, please. So the moment, sort of the not so big secret is that just about everything about rollups is mostly centralized. We have seen, firstly, there's nothing wrong with the path of progressive decentralization. That is to say, you get things to work, you build up your user base, you build out your developer community, you make sure that things are working, are robust, and and so on and so forth. And then over time, you basically decentralize various aspects of your system, and this is a path that others have followed. And I think the rollup space will basically follow the same mantra for the foreseeable future. And so at the same time, though, we're sort of running things with some degree of efficiency. One could argue there is, things are a bit different though on the zero knowledge space, where there's a lot of proof of work that needs to happen, as opposed to the fraud proof space, the optimistic space, where the amount of work is actually relatively less. But at the same time, there are advantages of throughput and latency when it comes to centralized system, deploying decentralized system by and large. And so how to attain these kinds of advantages in decentralized setting is actually relatively unclear, right? So, and the other thing is that decentralization comes in different shapes, right? So this is kind of a multidimensional kind of property ultimately. So we can talk about node ownership, we can talk about data center diversity, we can talk about geo-distribution and geodiversity. And then sort of a question that begs itself is like, well, how much decentralization is good enough? Next slide, please. So if you stare at this chart which covers like the last 6 months of Ethereum validator growth, you see that, at the moment, Ethereum has like a gigantic number, over 800,000, like close to 900,000, give or take, in terms of number of validators. So, and this is like almost a twofold increase in a relatively short period of time as well. So, well, the question is like, what's a big enough number? Like, is that too many? Is that the right number? Is it, like, should we ask for more? Should we ask for fewer? Is it like over provisioning things? And I think answers are kind of elusive. And actually, people have looked at the Ethereum validator ecosystem in quite a lot of detail, quite frankly, right? And so they find some interesting sort of measurements, like, for example, this website, eastsunshine.com, provides a variety of metrics. And in fact, they give you sort of a health score, so to speak. I think for that time, it was like 58%, right? And so they basically rate the Ethereum ecosystem on a bunch of scales. And so they look at things like consensus client diversity, right? So like other things other than GEF that people are running, and how often is that happening? The things related to, let's say, geolocation diversity here on the right. staking pool diversity, right? So basically, it's like a single pool dominating the ecosystem, non-pool based validators, right? So like, what is it? Solo staking, that sort of thing. I mean, is that present? Is that prevalent? That sort of thing. So you can even, for something that we genuinely believe to be quite decentralized, you can sort of go and ask a whole bunch of interesting questions when it comes to decentralization. And so, next slide, please. A question that I would ask about this is next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Well, so what to do? Like, do we want to replicate the same, thing for rollups? I mean, is it sensible to expect every validator to basically become a sequencer or something like that? And that's, to my mind, not entirely clear at all. I think some aspects of this perhaps could be sensible. Like, for example, maybe not everybody should be running the exact same piece of code. So we are not basically just, reducing our potential availability because we are sharing the same exact bugs everywhere, right? That's just an availability argument. But the idea that you need to have, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of nodes doing your sequencing, I'm not sure that I'm sold on that at all, let's say. Firstly. Secondly, even with that really significant number of nodes, we're not quite where we are or where we would have been in the Web2 space. Like if we go back and think about the cloud for just a second, right? People talk about high availability systems. Well, metrics like 5/9 of availability, for example, come up quite often. And there's very little of anything, even in the Ethereum ecosystem, but in blockchain in general, that even starts to sort of resemble these numbers related to availability. And so, one could pose a question like, well, if you think about sequence designs, if we're comparing different designs, to each other, I mean, should we basically be aiming at these kinds of high availability outcomes? And what's the right way to get them? And maybe it's actually not trying to increase the number of nodes to gigantic amounts. Maybe it's, there should be focus on perhaps something else entirely. And so here's another question that is often conflated, but frankly, I think is causing more confusion than it should. So does decentralization imply permissionless participation? Can you basically have a system that's relatively centralized, but where things are permissioned in some ways that the community believes is appropriate, right? Because if things are entirely permissionless, then you basically have the Sybil problem. You have potentially more DOS-related problems as well. And so is that what we want as well? So not entirely obvious, I would argue. At the bottom, you see a reference to a paper that looks at measurements of Bitcoin and Ethereum sort of in a variety of dimensions of decentralization, if you're interested in these topics and reading about these topics. Next slide, please. So let's talk about sequencers just a bit more. So sequencers, and this is where, people spend quite a lot of time and sort of mental energy, if you will. So I think the majority of work, not all of it, but the majority of work has been sort of lifted, if you will, from permissionless consensus literature. So basically, people look at a bunch of variants of DFT-based consensus, and they basically reason about some of the latest approaches there, things like hot stuff 2, fast hot stuff, and they look at essentially taking that and moving this into a POS setting and basically getting performance numbers that those kinds of algorithms genuinely give you, which is to say, maybe a latency of, let's say, 1 to 3 seconds for most distributions. The throughput, though, might be a little bit more limited. Some people have suggested DAG-based solutions, but we have not seen those deployed or experimented with in practice, let's say. It's not obvious, though, that, we should basically replicate a design that was there for state machine replication to the problem of sequencing. The problem of sequencing is its own specialized thing, right? I mean, nobody said that we should just basically take the latest and greatest in BFT consensus and just wholesale move it to this space. I think that's not entirely obvious at all. Another thing that's also not obvious to me as well is what's the right way to connect, if you will, or to align sequencing and data availability provisioning, right? So there's one argument for modularity where these things are provided by different vendors and so on and so forth. But the challenge is that modularity is ultimately somewhat more difficult to make more reliable, right? If you worry about, 5/9 of availability, how do you actually take a modular design and make it work with 5/9? I would say that that's a highly non-obvious kind of question to answer. Next slide, please. Another sort of thing is that that comes up a lot is sequencers and MEV and sequencers as MEV extractors. And so basically there are sort of two extreme points of view that are often taken here. So one is that prevent, like we should just stop or try to stop MEV at all costs. And there's a lot of work that's focused on various commutative schemes, private mempools, basically blinding transactions, things of that sort, where the sequencer is not able to really interpret what is being sequenced, right? And so such it's got a hard time basically profitably, doing MEV extraction, right? As well as fairness-focused consensus algorithms, things like Themis from Tech and a variety of others. But at the same time, there's a lot of doubt in terms of like, well, can we really suppress all dangerous or all pernicious forms of MEV, and should we even try, right? And then you sort of go to the other side of this spectrum that we will oftentimes, right? So, well, MEV should be embraced. So MEV can play a positive role, and it should just encourage node runners. And this is like, in some sense, the better way to compensate sequences than it is to pay them money or to pay them sequencer fees, right? And so, we should just basically take the latest and greatest in PBS and ePBS from mainnet, from Ethereum's mainnet, and just basically repeat the whole thing, and then basically have flashbots as part of the picture as well. So my sense is that these are fairly extreme points of view. I'm not entirely sure what's in the middle. I wonder if there's something that's a little bit less extreme, let's say, that is a middle ground here. And I think this question is especially relevant when you're thinking about not only L2s, but L3s, hyperchains that sit on top of L2s. That's what we call them, hyperchains, for example, enterprise settings, right? There's a company, and the company doesn't really want its MEV to be extracted by somebody else. I think that's just inappropriate for the company setting, right? Like, how do we stop that without sort of becoming too rigid and too crazy about it, if you will? Next slide, please. I think the part that's actually receiving perhaps a little bit less attention than it should, although it's certainly getting some these days, is provers, right? And basically there is ongoing and frankly non-stop progress in proof systems. I think the progress is not going to be like reaching a fixed point, reaching its limit for the foreseeable future. I think we can expect to see progress on the proof system side. We recently released Bujum as our proof system, but I think, again, that's not the end of that story. And, people will experiment with any number of things related to folding. There are exciting, updates on parallelizing provers. There was a paper that was accepted at Oakland Security and Privacy from Berkeley, from Don Song's group, on some of these things, showing really exciting, scale-ups from prover parallelization. So I think all of these things will be the subject of a lot of focus for the next months and years, which is to say speed of proof production, single core, reducing hardware requirements, and then figuring out how to ultimately increase parallelism, as well as to connect custom hardware to the task of proof generation, proof production. And I think, we actually don't know what the ultimate sort of steady state will look like at this point. We are experimenting, and there's no shortage of interest from hardware makers to basically make this process a great deal more efficient as well. So next slide, please. And that's kind of what I already said, right? So lots of players interested in producing new proof systems. We just saw, updates from folks at A16Z on Jolt and Lasso, as well as some interesting updates from people trying to do aggressive folding. And on the right-hand side, you see some names of companies that are trying to basically build advanced hardware for this. And next slide, please. Yeah, so in a sense, like prover decentralization and opening the prover game up for others, I think is super interesting. The moment it sort of becomes even mildly available, I think there'll be a great deal of interest, and we already are speaking to people who are keen to get into this space. But yeah, like, should it be permissionless? How diverse should the hardware setup be? And what happens if provers decide to do something that is slightly unpredictable, perhaps malicious, and so on and so forth. And this is where you basically have, next slide, please, any number of open issues. Next slide, please. In terms of how to, oh no, before that, please. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's it. How to basically make it so that there's no, like, we don't end up with a winner-take-all possibility where somebody with a really advanced hardware setup that they don't share with anybody else just basically wins every block, right? And so how to, I mean, that's one open question to my mind. Also, another question is how to have variable pricing. If I'm willing to pay more to have my proofs achieve finality faster, can I do that? And so what are the means by which I can achieve that? It's actually not entirely clear how to sort of create an alignment between incentives and prover work. Next slide, please. And so on tokenomics, let me just say that, we've seen a number of tokenomic formulas that have emerged over the last several years, and some of them have come from DeFi, let's say. So stake-based governance, stake-based protocol participation, things of that sort. I think it's tempting to just lift them and move them into this space. I'm not sure that this is a great match, quite frankly. And even then, we have seen any number of problems with like stake-based governance when it comes to DeFi protocols as well. I don't think it's like necessarily a perfect system. We've seen, any number of governance activities that have not been quite as trustworthy as perhaps they should have been, that sort of thing. And so maybe we should take a different approach here. Maybe we should sort of stop focusing on POS and staking and like take more of a mining-based approach, right? Where, participation and proving is actually more of a focus area, right? And we should actually reward provers a bit more than we reward people holding stake in the protocol. Just a thought. I don't think that we really have consensus, no pun intended, on how this should be done. But next slide, please. I think it's fair to ask what kind of outcomes do we want? And I think one of the outcomes we do want in rollups is we want to have speed, we want to have low latency of when it comes to both soft finality, which is generally what sequencers give you, as well as like finality that you get from the prover, as well as high throughput. And then other properties like censorship resistance and maybe reduction in MEV, but not clear to what degree, as well as high network availability. And how to get these things from tokenomics, I think, is actually a tricky question. I'm not sure that there are immediate answers that sort of jump to my mind, at least. And the other thing is that if we are sort of, perhaps in the race to the bottom, I'm reluctant to use that term, but I think you know what I mean. Like we are in the process of reducing fees for the end user, right? We're in the process of making the blockchain more affordable. Well, how do we keep node runners interested? Like, how do we keep validators interested? And then the process of like doing highly specialized proving, like how do we essentially keep them interested, given that there's probably some capital expenditure that needs to go into that as well. Next slide, please. Just wanted to really briefly touch on the topic that was actually covered in the previous presentation, which is like, how do we, the thing is that like rollups is not just math, right? I mean, rollups at the moment are fairly complex distributed systems, and there are many ways in which things can go wrong, and we need to, reason about at least availability, implementation bugs, which is what Kenzie talked about, as well as infrastructure vulnerabilities. And there's a variety of interesting projects that kind of focus on sort of all of these aspects of things. So bugs, next slide, please. Bugs and proof production is something that's been the focus of a bunch of projects in the last 3 to 6 months. I think this will just keep expanding. Some interesting references for you debating. Next slide, please. So one question that doesn't maybe get addressed quite as much is that, like, how do we sort of bring the right software engineering discipline? I mean, circuit generation is a pretty difficult activity, let's say, and this is where bugs can be found. But at the same time, we want to be in an environment where, developers are relatively free to basically, change things with quite a lot of code velocity. And so how do we basically marry this robustness with the fact that software engineering needs to happen fairly quickly is quite an interesting open question. And then next slide, please. So the last point to make here is that we see a lot of efforts on the mainnet, on Ethereum's mainnet, things like Cape from Espresso Systems, Railgun, as well as a bunch of other projects, as well as proposals when it comes to stealth addresses and things of that sort, as well as more aggressive proposals from, for example, Aztec 3 on hybrid privacy, where execution can be private as well. And so the question is, well, should any of that be provided out of the box by the layer 2, or should the layer 2 just act as an acceleration facility? And I think there is something there that's not entirely obvious as well. I'm not sure that anybody but Aztec has taken a strong position when it comes to these things. Next slide, please. And in fact, last slide. So this is what I just covered, fairly briefly, given the time constraints. Happy to take whatever questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So I guess one thing I kind of also wanted to dive a little bit more into was the prover decentralization aspect, and you kind of uh, inferred a little bit on the proof of work aspect of a prover decentralization, and I sort of like bring back that the POW era. So in terms of like prover decentralization, like um so far from what I see, it's like a lot of the we're trying to decentralize it for better liveness assumptions. But are there other properties that you're specifically looking for from those proof of decentralization work to write, let's say, meet certain criteria that you want for those like decentralized prover network?
Yeah, I think it's not just liveness. I think ultimately, frankly, if we approach it from the economic standpoint, it's ultimately the cost of proof production, right? Like how much does integrity cost? Like, I mean, where are we as a system, as a rollup, compared to just raw execution in Ethereum, right? And essentially, how do we reduce it while, having sufficient levels of decentralization? And that's a question that I posed early on, which is like, well, how many is enough? Like, if we have basically 5 provers, well, is that good enough? And in some sense, it's a hard question to answer. I'd rather not answer it at the moment. I think there's quite a lot of subtlety here. So I'd say that, it's the latency as well as ultimate cost of proof production that we are after in the system in a steady state.
Gotcha. And also regarding the I guess the sequencer side of things. So I think you made a very interesting point about like how it's not obvious to just like bring in the existing BFT consensus and they kind of like just like slap it onto the whatever you call it decentralized sequencers. But then in that case, like how do you foresee sort of like in a near future like the way that sequencer would exist for let's say ZK Sync, like especially now that maybe it's not that obvious that we should rely on some form of POS. What do you foresee as a way to sort of governance around the sequencers for those big L2s?
Look, it's the same path of progressive decentralization, right? And the problem is that the path is not entirely linear. So my suspicion is that, it's quite clear that decentralization is now future, right? And how exactly, like, what are the steps? I think that's the part that's a little bit more mysterious at the moment. I think we'll probably go with something that's perhaps following some of these designs, but I think we're also working on something that's a lot more adventurous, let's say, and is a better sort of match in terms of the nature of sequencing as well as the nature of what we are providing there, and also with a kind of with an eye towards like, well, how many of these things do you need, and are you ultimately after high availability, or do you really need to basically have replication, right? So kind of like if you basically look at deploying it to some of these systems, be that Tendermint or Swiss consensus, let's say people look at 100 nodes. But again, like the same question sort of comes out, which is like, well, what's special about 100 nodes? And again, maybe not too much is special about 100 nodes.
Gotcha. And also like given that especially around like big rollups, there are a lot of like projects that are recently trying to, I guess, push this like modularity thesis, and people are in some way like maybe taking parts of the rollup stack and trying to build something very specific about it. Like what do you have from the perspective of you building ZK-Sync? Do you have any takes on like those aspects of modularities that is brought in by individual projects, and how you see like whether it's a good aspect of it or some not so good aspect of it from your perspective?
I think modularity is a great way to push a certain sort of angle, if you will. I mean, be that data availability or shared sequencing. We appreciate where those teams are coming from. I think it's an exciting exploration. I think, again, like piecing these things together in a way that gives you a reliable and robust system that kind of, I mean, I keep mentioning, 5 nines of availability, but you know what I mean, right? So something that's really kind of like just works day in and day out, right? Is a challenge. And that's true in a variety of ways, right? I mean, if you have basically, let's say diverse non-overlapping validator sets that don't like really connect to each other, everything is independent. I mean, in a certain sense, like everything has to work for the system to work end to end, right? So that's for the one aspect. The other one is that if you have multiple tokens at play, then things are potentially greatly complicated by that as well. So my sense is that I really enjoy some of these explorations. I think they are there for a very good reason. But at the same time, if our goal is to get to the end result faster, they can be somewhat challenging to build with, let's say.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you, Ben, for today's time and a great talk about all the rollup questions that you have
My
raised.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.